Hello, and welcome to the Desert Harvest Solar Project Draft Environmental Impact Statement and Draft Plan Amendment Public Information Workshop. The Bureau of Land Management thanks you for attending. This presentation will explain the BLM's purpose and need, project alternatives, including the agency-preferred alternative, environmental effects of the proposed project and alternatives, mitigation measures to reduce adverse effects, and how you can comment on the draft EIS. After this presentation, you will have an opportunity to provide oral comments on the draft EIS. A court reporter is here to record your oral comments. You can also submit comments in writing via mail or email to the BLM at any time during the draft EIS comment period. All comments will be considered. The Secretary of the Interior is authorized to grant rights of way on public lands for systems of generation, transmission, and distribution of energy. The BLM's purpose and need for the Desert Harvest EIS is to respond to Annexco's application under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act for a right-of-way grant to construct, operate, and decommission a solar generation facility and its associated infrastructure in compliance with federal laws. The BLM will decide whether to approve with modification, or deny issuance of a right-of-way grant to Annexco for the proposed solar project. BLM will decide whether or not to grant a right-of-way, and if so, under what terms and conditions, and whether to amend the California Desert Conservation Area Land Use Plan. The EIS will be used to consider whether the California Desert Conservation Area Plan should be amended to designate the lands as suitable or unsuitable for solar energy development, and whether to allow the transmission line outside of a designated utility corridor. In accordance with the National Environmental Policy Act, referred to as NEPA, an environmental impact statement was prepared to identify, analyze, and disclose potential environmental effects of the proposed project. BLM is the federal lead agency responsible for the preparation of the environmental impact statement according to NEPA. The County of Riverside is the lead agency under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, and a cooperating agency under NEPA. The county has discretionary authority to issue public use permits for any of the generation intertie line, or GenTie, alternatives, as each crosses private lands under county jurisdiction. The EIS has been prepared to a CEQA equivalent standard in order to facilitate state and local permitting for the project. The National Park Service is a cooperating agency under NEPA. The Park Service has actively engaged in EIS planning and reviewing documentation. The Park Service has no decision-making authority over the proposed project. However, the Park Service has an interest in ensuring that the effects of the projects on Joshua Tree National Park are minimized. In fall 2011, public scoping for the project was conducted to identify the scope of issues to be addressed and the range of actions, alternatives, mitigation measures, and significant effects to be analyzed in the draft EIS. Comments received during scoping assisted the BLM in determining the scope of the draft EIS. In addition to the no action alternative and several variations on the no project alternative, numerous action alternatives for both the solar generation facility and GenTie line are analyzed in the draft EIS. For a complete project, both a generation and transmission alternative would be chosen. 4 solar facility action alternatives are considered, all of which would be located entirely on BLM land. Alternative 4 is the proposed solar facility. This is the alternative for which Annexco submitted the application. It would generate 240,000 megawatt-hours per year on 1,208 acres of BLM-managed land using 5-foot-high photovoltaic panels. Alternative 5 excludes the portion of the wildlife habitat management area that overlaps the proposed facility footprint. This alternative would allow the BLM-managed land within the wildlife habitat management area to remain undeveloped. It would generate 230,000 megawatt-hours per year on 1,161 acres of BLM-managed land using 5-foot-high photovoltaic panels. Alternative 6, the reduced footprint solar project, excludes the southern discontinuous portion of the facility footprint. It also removes a small portion of land that is habitat for sensitive plants. It would generate 200,000 megawatt-hours per year on 1,044 acres of BLM-managed land using 5-foot-high photovoltaic panels. Alternative 7, the high-profile reduced footprint solar project, would have the same footprint as Alternative 6, but use taller panels. It would generate 260,000 megawatt-hours per year on 1,044 acres of BLM-managed land using 15-foot-high photovoltaic panels. 4 Jintai action alternatives also are considered in the draft EIS. Alternative B is the proposed Jintai line, which would share transmission towers with the Desert Sunlight Solar Farm currently under construction directly north of the project. This transmission line would be 12.1 miles in length, including 11.4 miles on BLM land, 0.6 miles on Metropolitan Water District land, and 0.5 miles on Riverside County-owned land. Alternative C would use the same right-of-way as Alternative B, but would construct new transmission towers. This transmission line would be the same length and follow the same route as Alternative B. Alternative D would cross the Chuckwalla Valley, partially outside an established utility corridor. This transmission line would be 10.1 miles long, including 6 miles on BLM land and 4.1 miles on private land. Alternative E would also cross the Chuckwalla Valley, but would occur on a larger portion of Metropolitan Water District land. This transmission line would be 11.5 miles long, including 7.2 miles on BLM land and 4.3 miles on Metropolitan Water District land. BLM's agency-preferred alternative is 7B, which is the high-profile, reduced-footprint alternative combined with the shared Jintai alternative. The environmentally superior alternative under CEQA is Alternative 6B, which is the reduced-footprint alternative combined with the shared Jintai alternative. The project team evaluated the feasibility of several other solar facility and Jintai line alternatives. These alternatives were not carried forward for detailed study in the draft EIS because they did not meet BLM's purpose and need, were determined to be practically or technically infeasible as informed by the applicant's interests and objectives, would have substantially similar effects to an alternative that is analyzed, or would result in substantial resource conflicts. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service suggested that BLM consider an alternative that would remove 2 BLM-managed parcels from the solar field site to widen a desert tortoise habitat corridor. Expansion of this corridor would allow for north-south movement of desert tortoise and other wildlife. This alternative was eliminated for detailed study because a statewide evaluation of habitat connectivity showed that this habitat does not provide a movement corridor for desert tortoise. This map shows areas of modeled high and low desert tortoise habitat suitability, with dark brown areas providing high suitability habitat and pale yellow areas providing low suitability habitat. As you can see, the area of the proposed project provides low suitability habitat and does not provide an important habitat connectivity corridor between the Chuckwalla Desert Wildlife Management Area, the purple area to the south, and Joshua Tree National Park, the green area to the north. Based on this habitat model, on the fragmented and disturbed landscape surrounding the site, and the sparse tortoise sign at the proposed project site, this area is not considered to provide desert tortoise habitat connectivity. Scoping comments recommended use of private lands as alternatives. Private lands within Chuckwalla Valley were considered for siting the proposed solar energy project, and 3 sites were identified as potential alternative sites. A private land alternative would require aggregation of numerous semi-contiguous parcels owned by separate individuals, making the alternative technically and economically infeasible. In addition, under NEPA, a private land alternative does not respond to BLM's purpose and need to consider an application for the authorized use of public lands for a solar facility. Scoping comments also recommended use of contaminated sites as alternatives. Only 2 small contaminated sites suitable for solar development were identified in the general region of Devers-Palo Verde transmission line. Due to the limited number of contaminated parcels in the area, it would be impossible to acquire sufficient contiguous or semi-contiguous contaminated acreage for the project, making this alternative technically and economically infeasible. Alternative technologies, including solar, renewable, and non-renewable technologies, were also considered and eliminated due to environmental impacts, statutory conflicts, or infeasibility in meeting the project's purpose and need. Conservation and demand-side management were also considered as alternatives, but were eliminated because they represent too great a departure from the project in the application and are therefore ineffective under NEPA. Furthermore, the specific purpose and need of the project would not be met by these alternatives. The next section of this presentation summarizes the environmental effects of the proposed project and alternatives that are identified in the EIS. Project construction would generate emissions of particulate matter and other pollutants. Mitigation measures would limit these emissions to the extent possible, but models suggest that residual impacts would persist. However, impacts would be temporary and limited to the duration of the construction activities. The EIS includes 4 mitigation measures to reduce impacts to air resources. Surveys were conducted to determine the habitats, special status species, and wildlife that could occur on the project site. 3 special status plant species were found on site. Several special status bird species were found foraging on site, and American badger and desert kit fox burrows were found on site. Sign of desert tortoise was identified on site, but no live animals were found. Biological surveys of the project site and Gentile alternatives are ongoing, and additional results will be presented in the final EIS. Construction and operation of the project would disturb vegetation and habitat. The project site would directly remove several special status plants occurring on the project site. The project would impact state jurisdictional streambeds through removal and degradation of habitat and vegetation. The project would disturb wildlife habitat during construction and operation. Construction of the project would result in minor disturbance of habitat connectivity in the upper Chuckwalla Valley. Construction, operations and maintenance, and decommissioning would create noise, lighting, dust, and other disturbances that would affect adjacent habitat. Wildlife displaced by the project would need to establish new home ranges and would compete for food and other resources with off-site wildlife. The EIS includes 18 mitigation measures to reduce impacts to biological resources. Impacts to biological resources would be reduced by mitigation measures, one of which specifically requires off-site compensatory habitat protection, and one of which requires the applicant to contribute to a desert tortoise population connectivity effectiveness monitoring plan. The project would nevertheless result in adverse effects to biological resources. Archaeological and built environment surveys and an indirect effects study have been conducted. Reports presenting the results of these studies are currently being drafted. Preliminary results indicate that 36 historic and prehistoric resources have been identified within the area of potential effect of the solar facility and Gentile alternatives. 32 of these are isolates, 2 are historic archaeological sites, and 2 are prehistoric districts that are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Of the isolates, 6 are prehistoric resources, and the remainder are historic resources. Tribal consultation was initiated on October 4, 2011, and is ongoing. An ethnographic literature review is also being prepared. The project would result in a substantial increase in traffic noise levels along Kaiser Road north of Lake Tamarisk Road during construction and decommissioning. Mitigation measures would limit construction activities to daylight hours. However, there would still be a temporary, unavoidable adverse effect from increased noise. The EIS includes 1 mitigation measure to reduce impacts to noise receptors. During construction, the solar facility workforce is expected to average 100 full-time employees with a peak of 250 total on-site workers. The workforce for the Gentile line is expected to average 30 employees over the construction period, with a peak of 65 employees. Inexco has indicated that the construction workforce would be recruited from within Riverside County and the surrounding area. The project is expected to employ up to 8 full-time employees over the long term. On a cumulative basis, in combination with other land development projects in the area, the project would contribute to large-scale land use conversion. Fugitive dust, traffic, and lighting from construction would create temporary visual distractions for users of the Joshua Tree Wilderness Area, the Chuckwalla Mountains Wilderness Area, and the Desert Lily Preserve Area of Critical Environmental Concern. In particular, temporary noise and nighttime lighting could affect the wilderness experience within these areas, making human presence more noticeable. Also, fugitive dust from construction would create a temporary visual distraction for a limited number of users of portions of these areas, although implementation of mitigation measures would control generation of dust. Some construction activity may take place at night, which would result in adverse night lighting visual effects. Mitigation measures would reduce these impacts, but there would still be an unavoidable adverse effect on wilderness recreation. The EIS includes 3 mitigation measures to reduce impacts to special designation areas and recreation. Construction of the project would require extensive land scarring and vegetation clearance. The project site is visible from a large area, and the project would introduce extensive structural visual contrast. Mitigation measures would reduce the impacts of this visual contrast, but unavoidable long-term adverse effects would remain. The EIS includes 6 mitigation measures to reduce impacts to visual resources. However, mitigation would not eliminate all visual impacts, some of which would be long-term and unavoidable. Project construction could result in local groundwater level drawdown, which occurs when groundwater pumping lowers the aquifer level such that other wells in the vicinity of pumping activities experience an increased depth to groundwater, requiring greater energy to draw the same volume of water from affected wells. Under a conservative cumulative development scenario, construction and operation of Desert Harvest would contribute to groundwater basin overdraft, which occurs when the quantity of water removed from a groundwater basin exceeds the rate of recharge to that basin. Mitigation measures would eliminate the project's contribution to overdraft conditions. However, mitigation could result in the need to truck water to the site from outside the basin, which would result in adverse traffic, air quality, and noise effects. The EIS includes 9 mitigation measures to reduce impacts to water resources. The EIS process can be successful only with your participation. The BLM decision maker considers every one of your comments in revising the EIS and reaching a decision. Comments on the draft EIS are currently being accepted via mail, email, or orally at this public information workshop. In order to be most useful, your comments must be received by the end of the 90-day public comment period, which closes July 18, 2012. In a few minutes, you will have an opportunity to give your oral comments on the draft EIS. The workshop facilitator will explain the ground rules for providing oral comments. A court reporter will record your comments. Out of courtesy to all of the meeting attendees, please limit your comments to 3 minutes. If there is adequate time, speakers may be given additional turns to speak. If you wish to provide oral comments, print your name on a speaker card, which can be found at the table near the entryway. You can also provide written comments using the form provided at the entry table, or by mail or email at the address shown on the screen. The final EIS will be developed after careful consideration of your comments. If the BLM decides to grant a right-of-way for the proposed project or an alternative, a final EIS must be approved and a record of decision must be issued before the right-of-way may be granted. Also, the applicant will be required to show compliance with all applicable federal, state, and local laws and regulations before being granted a notice to proceed upon which construction may commence. Permits from other responsible agencies, including Riverside County, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, and the California Department of Fish and Game are required. If approved, construction of the Desert Harvest Solar Project is expected to begin in January of 2013, with a target in-service date anticipated in January of 2015. The workshop facilitator will now begin the public comment portion of the workshop. After this public comment period, please visit the project displays to learn more about the project. Project team members are available to discuss the project and answer questions. Thank you for your participation.